Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Jumong, the Beast Hunter, and hopefully it doesn't become outdated within a few hours of upload again this time. And so with that said, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Jumong is a long-range DPS champion who excels in dealing strong, consistent, as well as burst damage from afar with his bow and arrows. Unlike the Jumong before the 0.12 patch, this new Jumong doesn't have as much survivability when he doesn't have any energy or weapon charges, but he can still be extremely deadly later on in the round, once he has gained a little bit of energy and weapon charges, since these resources give him a lot more options when dealing with incoming enemies. His sustain is now pretty good, since a few of his abilities can provide him with some healing, and his control options haven't really been removed, and so he's still a very good champion to control the flow of the round with, if the enemy team composition isn't some rushdown melee composition. While it may seem like he is better for beginners now since he has more healing, I feel that it is actually harder for beginners to pick up Jumong now because he relies even more on hitting his basic attacks consistently and he doesn't have as many escape options as before. So in general, I would like to say that his playstyle is really fun because I really like how he plays and feels now. He is still one of my favourite ranged champions in the game. Because Jumong can be quite susceptible to being rushed down, I think that he isn't the most beginner-friendly champion to learn however. Consistently hitting his basic attacks is almost a requirement, and you also have to keep making the correct judgments and decisions right from the start if you want to maintain the advantage over the enemy team. It can be pretty tough to perform well consistently as Jumong, and so it will take some time to learn how to play him effectively, I feel. So yeah, before we start, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Freya and Rook to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections and have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Jumong's abilities before we talk about his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses, and then we'll look at his Battlerites options before we finally finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Jumong. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about his abilities, starting with his left click or mouse 1 ability, Hunting Arrow. This is his basic attack and it is a simple ranged attack that deals quite a bit of damage. Successful hits with your basic attack on enemies or the central orb gives you weapon charges that can stack up to 3. 3 weapon charges allows you the ability to recast your mouse 2, spacebar and Q abilities after casting them the first time, and this is actually very important for Jumong's survival, but we'll get to that soon. Having 1 or 2 weapon charges doesn't give any other benefits, and so you'll want to get to 3 charges as soon as you can, and have it at 3 weapon charges as often as you can if possible, because it is so important. Moving on, Jumong's right click or mouse 2 ability is Steady Shot, and it is just a normal, long cast time, huge burst damage range attack. Pretty simple. Because of its long cast time, and it doesn't penetrate enemies like Jade's snipe ability, it is mostly just used as a zoning tool, or for getting the orb from 28 down to 0 with 1 hit, or perhaps even when the enemy is stunned and you can get a free hit easily. As I mentioned when talking about the mouse 1 ability, you can recast Jumong's mouse 2 ability when you have 3 charges, but I think that it is best not to waste the 3 weapon charges on this ability unless you know for sure you will not die in the next 10 to 20 seconds or so, since you typically want to save those weapon charges for his spacebar ability. Coincidentally, let's talk about his spacebar ability next. Jumong's spacebar ability is Black Arrow, and it is a dual function ability, because it can be a survival or damage ability depending on the situation. What it does is that Jumong dashes forward toward the direction he's moving, while firing an arrow toward the mouse's target direction. While dashing, Jumong is invulnerable, and this is why it is a survival ability for Jumong, since it is very useful for avoiding damaging abilities. When enemies are close to dying, it can be used as an offensive ability as well, since it does provide a little bit of damage, and it can provide a bit of a gap close as well with a little dash, and so it is a pretty versatile ability, I would say. You'll definitely be trying to recast this ability when you need to when you have 3 charges. Don't worry if you don't have a good use for the recast, since the 3 weapon charges will only be expended when you actually recast it, so you can use it only when necessary. Do bear in mind that the ability still goes on cooldown if you don't use the recast, so do be careful. Onto his Q ability. Jumong's Q ability is Rain of Arrows, and this used to be his R ability, so don't get confused. This is Jumong's primary AoE and zone control ability, and it is super powerful when used correctly. What it does is arrows will rain down at a targeted location, and enemies within the area will be snared and also be dealt some damage over time. Pretty sweet. The best part about the ability is that it has a very long range, and it is an area of effect ability. It doesn't trigger counters, it can be cast behind walls, it can be used to zone enemies, so I think it's a very strong ability indeed. And so it's definitely one of its best abilities, I would say. Even though it doesn't do as much damage as before, and so it is a lot less lethal, the zoning and healing that you get from it is very valuable. If you didn't already know, Jumong's Seeker's Mark debuff now gives healing when triggered, instead of incapacitating an enemy. The first hit from the rain of arrows actually applies Seeker's Mark, and since the ability is fairly easy to land, this ability will be your primary way of applying Seeker's Mark onto enemies. If you prepare to hit your enemies with your mouse 1, mouse 2 or spacebar abilities after hitting your Chyill onto them, this can be a pretty reliable way of getting some good healing on yourself. Practicing hitting those 3 abilities when it counts will definitely boost your survivability with Jumong, I think. While the ability can be recasted when you have 3 weapon charges, just like the mouse 2 and spacebar ability, I still feel like saving the charges for recasting the spacebar ability is still the better choice. Maybe if your enemies are all ranged enemies and you want to use the extra Q to finish someone off, or to zone them away from the ops or something, then I guess recasting Q can be a pretty good choice as well, since it can be pretty strong to do that sometimes. Moving on, Jumong's E ability is Bear Trap, and what it does is basically Jumong will lay down a trap, and the trap will root all nearby enemies when at least one enemy walks over it. The ability doesn't do any damage, and it is fairly easy to avoid, so it is mostly just used as a zoning tool. There are multiple Battlerites that enhance this ability, but because there's no good way to guarantee that enemies will step into it without interference by a teammate at least, and so the ability is usually just used for zoning, like preventing enemies from running straight to healing orbs easily or something. And so those were all of Jumong's abilities that doesn't cost energy. Now let us move on to those which do. Starting again with Jumong's R ability. His R ability is Prowl, and what it does is remove all movement impairing effects on Jumong while making him immaterial and move 100% faster. Running into enemies while in this state inflicts the Seeker's Mark debuff onto them, and so that can be detonated for some healing for Jumong as well. All of these effects come only at the cost of 25 energy, and so this ability is definitely Jumong's best survival ability. Once he has at least 25 energy, Jumong can escape pretty much anything with this ability, so you'll definitely want to make the most out of it when you do use it, but just be careful of the 15 seconds cooldown after using it. Jumong can actually still use his abilities while in Prowl mode, so just do keep that in mind. You don't actually have to wait for the Prowl to end for him to continue attacking, so I think it's pretty sweet, I would say. Next up, Jumong's first EX ability is Guided Arrow, and this is his new Shift Mouse 1 ability. What it does is that he will fire an arrow that bounces 3 times, a bit like Paloma's Wolf ability. This ability can only hit each enemy once for a small amount of damage, but for each enemy hit, it also heals Jumong for a small amount, and it inflicts Seeker's Mark onto those that were hit. While the ability is not very useful at killing enemies, its value comes from the huge amounts of potential healing that you can get from it, so it shouldn't be underestimated. Even though it is his weakest ability that costs energy to me, then you should probably be using his energy for his other abilities. There are scenarios where using this ability is not the worst move, since the healing you get from it is quite good. In situations where you need healing, but your support teammate is a bit too far away, using this ability is a good way of getting some much needed healing. Just make sure you still have enough energy saved up for using R when you need it, since that is much more important than the healing you get from this ability. Moving on, Jumong's second EX ability is Seeker's Arrow, and this is his Shift Mouse 2 ability. It costs 25 energy, and what it does is that Jumong will fire an arrow that if it hits a target, it will turn around and hit the same target 2 more times. Each hit from this ability charges your weapon, and so this is a decent way of regaining weapon charges when you're in a pinch. The damage that it does is also nothing to scoff at, so I would say that it is a pretty decent ability. With a recent patch, the third hit of the ability actually gets improved by your Battlerites, which improve your mouse 1 ability, and so you can potentially get a lot more of this ability depending on what Battlerite you pick. This fact does make the ability much more appealing, even though the ability actually triggers counters, and it may not be ideal against champions with counters. But having said that, when it is used against champions without counters, it can actually be quite decent for some quick weapon charges and massive damage, which may prompt the enemy to use an escape just to avoid the amounts of damage that you can do with this ability every time you cast it. Getting hit by this whole ability is 36 damage total without any Battlerites, and so if you manage to fit in 1 or 2 mouse 1s in there, the total damage you've dealt is something like 52 to 68 damage, which is just crazy. Definitely a viable damage ability since it also charges up a lot quicker when firing it as compared to the normal mouse 2 ability. So you just gotta make sure that the enemy that you fire this at has already used their counters and escapes to make the most out of it at least. Finally, Jumong's ultimate on the F key is Dragon Slayer, and basically what the ability does is that Jumong can charge up an arrow, and the arrow will travel further depending on how long you charge it for, and it will also deal more damage depending on how long you charge it as well. When it hits a target, it will push the first target it hits along with it, and if the target is pushed into his ally, another 30 damage is dealt to the second target, and both enemies are stunned for some time. If the target is pushed into a wall, the extra stun effect is also applied. The ability sounds very strong, but it's actually pretty difficult to land it since most people can see the casting and react accordingly. Even casting it for its minimum period is long enough for people to react, and so it can be pretty unreliable to hit with it sometimes. Having said that though, it is pretty fun and it is also very satisfying when you do hit it onto an enemy. Killing 2 enemies at the same time with it to win the round is also the best feeling ever, as you can imagine. But yeah, if you're trying hard to win, then I highly suggest not using it simply and only use it when you have a guaranteed hit, since using your energy on your R and Shift Mouse 2 abilities is a better choice to me, I think. Do note however that the arrow when fully charged does 60 damage, and so you can use it to guarantee the AWP for your team since it can deal 60 damage straight up. If you can hit an enemy at the same time as securing the AWP, then that would be absolutely fantastic, but I wouldn't count on it if your enemy is somewhat decent. Perhaps varying up how long you charge it when using it can make it just a little bit more consistent. Having said all of that though, the minimum damage for the ability is now 45, which is only 15 short of the maximum charge up, so it can sometimes be worth it to just use it and fire it straight away since 45 damage is still a very big amount of damage. And so that's about it for Jumong's abilities. Now let us move on to his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Jumong's playstyle is a bit of a passive, stand behind and shoot kind of playstyle. Only when absolutely necessary, like when an enemy is 1 or 2 hits away from dying, should Jumong perhaps try to jump in aggressively to finish him off. If and only if he doesn't have a teammate who is better suited for that, of course. Most of Jumong's damage will come from his mouse 1 basic attack, and so you'll typically just stand behind your other teammates and just try to safely poke at the enemies with your mouse 1 attacks, coupled with some rain of arrows for some zoning and AoE damage. This is good also for some sustain while you're doing this, since you can pop those Seeker's marks with your mouse 1s fairly easily. Occasionally, you can try to use your mouse 2 or shift mouse 2 abilities for some added burst if you feel you can safely do so, and use your bear traps to control enemies' positioning so that you can have an easier time hitting them, or just try to stop them from going for orbs, etc. When you need to get enemies off of you or to avoid abilities, you can use your spacebar and R abilities as necessary. I typically use my spacebar and its recast to avoid abilities or get away from melee champions who have gotten close first, before using R to get away when I absolutely need it, since it does cost energy and it has a long cooldown. Furthermore, you have full control of where you're going with R, and so it is more reliable when trying to position yourself nicely after escaping with it. So overall, pretty simple actually when playing Jumong. The hard part about learning Jumong is actually getting used to his, I would say, slightly awkward attack animation and timings, since it is quite different from most other champions. I personally had to take quite a while to get used to it since I play different champions all the time, but if you only main one champion and spend most of the time playing Jumong only, then I don't think it should be a big deal. So that was Jumong's playstyle. Let's talk about his strengths and weaknesses now. One of Jumong's strengths is his ability to deal such high consistent damage from afar. Having a long range is very good since it gives you a big advantage over all other champions in that you can hit them at will, but they can't in return. Having such a long range and hard hitting ability as his basic attack is therefore, I feel, one of his biggest strengths and why he was in such a strong spot in the game before. He's still a pretty decent range champion now though, as long as he can survive in the round and hit enemies with his basic attack consistently. Well, at least that's what I feel. Moving on, I think that another one of Jumong's strengths is his ability to do true damage. Once more than 40 damage is dealt to a champion, any further damage is dealt as true damage because it cannot be healed up by healing abilities. The damaged champion would need to pick up health orbs or destroy the central orb to get some true healing to actually heal up those damage. Because all of Jumong's abilities deal such high damage, like his mouse 1, mouse 2, EX mouse 2 and his ultimate ability, he can actually very quickly start dealing true damage since just one mouse 2 and one mouse 1 will already deal 40 damage. After that, any further damage is true damage. Damage being dealt in larger chunks just mean that it is more unlikely for enemy support champions to be able to heal up the damage before it starts becoming true damage. So people sometimes underestimate Jumong's damage output, but the only reason for that is that Jumong is missing his shots. The moment he starts hitting them, the supports will start to struggle to keep up with healing that damage, and true damage will be dealt. Next up, I think that Jumong is also very strong at controlling the enemy's positioning. I'm not really talking about his ability to put out roots, snares, and those sorts of CC effects, but what I'm talking about is his ability to exert pressure on his enemies. Because Jumong has such a long range, and he can output so much damage from afar, he puts out a lot of pressure in a certain radius around him, and this makes it very easy to zone enemies away from each other, when you manage to separate them at least. This is a very useful thing to have, I think, since your enemies being separated would mean that it would be more difficult for them to support and help each other out, and furthermore you and your teammate can freely hit away at one of them while they struggle to regroup. So yeah, definitely a very strong trait to have. Other champions like Odor and Taya have this similar ability to really exert pressure on the enemy team. Moving on to his weaknesses, I think that one of Jumong's weaknesses is that he can be quite weak to certain melee champions. While he can zone them with his extreme long range, he doesn't have a lot of options once they have gotten close, even factoring in his spacebar and R abilities. Sometimes he can be caught without either one of those cooldowns, and melee champions with more than one way of closing the gap can often chase Jumong down quite effectively because he has one less cooldown already. Jumong can try to fight back, but because his attack speed is quite slow, enemy melee champions can quite easily dance around him and make it hard for him to hit the shots to try to even out the trade by at least doing some damage to the melee attacker. And so that's why I think that is one of his weaknesses. Next up, I think that Jumong is pretty reliant on his weapon charges and energy, and so this makes it one of his weaknesses as well. I would say that this could be his biggest weakness because until Jumong gets his 3 weapon charges or at least some energy to use his R, he's actually quite susceptible to getting bursted down since he doesn't have his spacebar recast and his immaterial from the R. And so the best time to deal with the Jumong is at the start of the round before he gets his weapon charges as well as some energy. Players who know this might make it hard for Jumong by just rushing him down once the round starts, and so you should try to be prepared for something of this sort happening when you play Jumong. If you have a good teammate, then you shouldn't need to worry about this too much since they'll likely be able to help you out a little bit as well when the enemies do try to rush you down. And finally, I think that another one of Jumong's weakness is that until you can consistently get your Mouse 1 hits in, he'll do almost no damage at all. His Q ability will help a little bit since it is fairly easy to hit, but the main damage source is still his Mouse 1 attacks. Most other champions have multiple ways of getting some damage onto enemies, but almost every part of Jumong's kit will rely on his Mouse 1 attacks, whether for energy or weapon charges. And so if you're against an enemy that is very good at dodging, or you're not very familiar with his attack speed yet, then it might be quite rough for a few rounds, since he is entirely reliant on hitting his Mouse 1s properly. Not to mention that the main way for popping those Seeker's marks is to hit your Mouse 1s on them as well, and so now even your healing and sustain depends on hitting your Mouse 1s. So definitely practice getting used to those Mouse 1s if you want to be great at Jumong. And so that's about it for his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Jumong's Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish, before I go through my thoughts on his Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it all out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read them all, let's continue. In the first round, I think that it will mostly be a choice between Perfect Shot and Viper. While Mark Prey is pretty good free healing, since if someone does step into your trap, you can easily hit your Mouse 1 onto them for a bit of healing. The tricky part is getting them to step into it in the first place, so I don't think it's that great just for some healing. Seeker's Mark is really easily applied onto enemies with your Q ability, so I don't think it is that necessary for the Bear Trap to apply it as well. Between Perfect Shot and Viper, I think that Perfect Shot is usually the better choice since it offers quite a bit of utility. Viper's Fading Haste only lasts 1 second in fact, and I personally don't like it a lot because if you choose to use your Mouse 1 after using spacebar, you would have wasted almost all of the Fading Haste, which would mean that you may as well not have picked the Battlerites in the first place. Having said that though, it is still a pretty good defensive choice if you think that you'll be rushed down by multiple melee enemies right off the bat. I think in those situations, it may be a worthy pickup. Perfect Shot is a good Battlerites all around right now because the 2 extra damage is nice and the stun is awesome. It is not only disruptive to the enemy, but it will also help you and your teammate land the next hit or 2 with that stun, so I think it is pretty awesome. You can also use it to interrupt channeling abilities as well, so I think it is probably the best pick in this first tier. Not to mention that the stun also gets applied to the third hit of your Shift Mouse 2 ability, so it makes it that much more deadly. On to the second tier, I think that all three picks are pretty good. Panther will be the best pick in general because it gives you that much more survivability with Jumong, with that reduced cooldown and increased duration for the Prowl ability. Especially that reduced cooldown, man, 3 seconds is huge. In 3 vs 3s, I think Trapper is a pretty good pick since having the additional Bear Trap makes it a lot likelier for your traps to hit at least 1 or 2 targets. The extra Bear Trap effectively increases the range of your E ability as well, so I think that's pretty sweet. Rooting a target in 3 vs 3s is quite a big deal, I think, because you have an extra teammate to deal massive damage onto the enemy that was trapped, so I think Trapper can be pretty good there. Furthermore, you also have one extra teammate to peel for you in case enemies try to jump you, and so Panther may be less required in 3 vs 3s to me. Just don't go too far out of position, I guess. Among the 3 Battlerites in this round, Power Shot is probably my least picked Battlerite. While the 6 extra damage on the Mouse 2 ability is nice and the knockback could be helpful as well, most of the time I'm either picking Panther for the survivability or Trapper for the control in 3 vs 3s, that I very seldom pick Power Shot to begin with. I guess you will probably need to weigh up how likely it is that you will need to use Prowl before you decide whether or not you can afford to pick Power Shot, I guess. Nevertheless, it is still a pretty solid pick if you can survive well enough without Panther. Moving on, in the third round are some good choices again. Rejuvenating Shot gives some decent extra healing when you pop Seeker's Mark with your Mouse 2 or with the third hit of your Shift Mouse 2, so that's pretty sweet. If you need more control, the extra snare from your Q ability that Crippling Hail gives can be pretty good too. This will make it better when trying to slow incoming melee champions or when trying to slow ranged enemies from sidestepping your Mouse 1 attacks. If you want more burst damage, for instance in cases where you don't need your spacebar as much for defensive purposes, then Precision can be pretty good as well for added burst damage and energy. So I suppose it really just depends on what you need in that particular matchup. I take each of the 3 choices about equally as often, depending on what my teammates is playing and what my opponents are playing, so I don't really have a personal favorite here. But if I were to pick one without really thinking too much about who I'm facing and all that, then I'll probably take Precision to maybe finish off an opponent faster if I get the chance to. Next up, in the 4th tier, I usually pick up Agility for the added movement speed. Not only does it help you with surviving since you move faster, it also helps a bit when you're attacking since you can catch up to enemies more easily. Death Mark can be a pretty good pickup too since those bonus damage can potentially add up to quite a bit of damage. However, do bear in mind that you will need to pop those marks in the first place to get that bonus damage. Because the main way you put Seeker's Marks onto enemies is with your Q ability, enemies can sometimes be out of range from your other abilities and so it might be too difficult to pop those marks. Not only that, because the marks only last for a few seconds on the enemy, you have to consider how many of those marks can you realistically pop in a round to make use of that bonus damage. And so because of these reasons, I still feel Agility is the better pick overall compared to Death Mark. Disabling Trap sounds really powerful in theory with the reduced damage and healing received, but unless you pick up Trapper in the second round, it is not very often that you actually get to trap somebody with a Bear Trap, and so it might be hard to get use out of that bonus. Even if you do get a trap off and the enemy is weakened, it just doesn't feel like it helps you kill them faster by all that much, and that's why I still feel Agility is the better choice in this tier. Finally, in the 5th and final tier, I think that the pickup will probably depend a little bit on the map you're playing on. Big game hunting inflicting Seeker's Marks doesn't feel that strong because very often enemies will be shot so far away that you'll be out of range to pop those marks in the first place. Also, enemies hit by ultimate will generally take some time out of combat as well, so it is not like they will jump straight back into your attack range soon enough for you to take advantage of the mark, so I don't think the Battlerites is all that great. But if you use it on an enemy and knock them into a nearby wall or their teammate, then I guess it can be pretty good. And so this will probably have to depend on the map, or the enemy team messing up so much by standing in a line in front of you where you're casting your ultimate ability, and so you just have to evaluate the likelihood of such a scenario happening before picking this Battlerite. Deadeye on the other hand will make it so that you can potentially deal 10 extra damage regardless of the map you're playing on. While you won't get much benefit out of this if you shoot your ultimate at minimum charge, you can potentially deal some extra damage if you charge it up a little bit, and so I think it is still pretty worth it if you don't really want to wait for the perfect opportunity to set up your ultimate in such a way which you can take advantage of the Seeker's Marks from big game hunting. That's my thoughts anyway. Personally, I usually take Deadeye so I can just use my ultimate whenever I want, but that's just me being lazy, haha. And so yeah, that's about it on Jumong's Battlerites. Now let us move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Jumong, as well as some potential combos with him. My first tip for playing Jumong is to take advantage of the long range he has. By now, I've probably mentioned about how big of a deal Jumong's long range is, and so you should definitely try to make use of it. I often see some Jumong who doesn't fully utilize his long range and sometimes get too close to enemies. This makes it easier for enemies to attack into Jumong, and so that's not what you want. Perhaps they were not used to hitting his basic attacks yet and want to get closer to the enemy, but even then, I think it is definitely worth practicing hitting enemies from as far away as you can to really make use of that range. The better you can make use of his range, the bigger the pressure you apply on the enemy by just being there, since they will be afraid that you might just shoot at them anytime for 16 damage for free. So yes, take advantage of his range. Moving on, another tip I have for playing Jumong is to not hesitate to using your spacebar whenever you need to dodge an important ability, even if your mouse is not in position for your black arrow to hit the enemy. Furthermore, it is also okay to use spacebar even when you don't have 3 weapon charges, so as long as you avoid an important ability with it as well. You just gotta make sure that you're ready for whatever happens next, perhaps by preparing your R to run away when you need to, if in case enemies try to go after you after you have used your spacebar to avoid an ability. Next up, a third tip I have is for aiming with Jumong. Because of his long attack animation, it is not advisable to hold down your mouse one and shoot, since you'll likely mistime quite a few shots this way. It is much better to separately hold and click as though you are drawing the bow and releasing the arrow one at a time, since you get a much better feel for the timing that way. While the old Jumong had some noteworthy combos that he could try to pull off, I think that the new Jumong shouldn't really rely that much on combos anymore, since he lost quite a bit of survivability. His available survival abilities, I feel, like his spacebar and R abilities, should be used as and when it is needed, except when an enemy is literally 1 or 2 hits away from dying. Then maybe it might be worth it to use the spacebar recast to chase down an enemy, or even R, just for the movement speed. On the other hand, his other abilities like his Q and E abilities can be used on cooldown to zone enemies. A decent way of trying to secure the orb is to use mouse 1 on it twice, followed by a mouse 2. The higher burst damage from the mouse 2 will give a better chance to secure the orb for your team, so definitely try for that. Just watch out for enemies who might try to interrupt you or to reflect that mouse 2 back towards you though. About teammates, I think that Jumong goes well with other strong ranged or ranged support teammates, since they can either sustain Jumong with more heals or put a lot of pressure on the enemies together with Jumong. Melee champions are also good for drawing attention away from Jumong, so that might be good as well, but you will have to be careful to not let your HP drop down too low, since it may be hard to get back some of those health without a proper support teammate to heal you back up. Those healing from Seeker's Mark is often not enough unless you're super good with your aim. Just remember that you might need your teammate to get enemies off of you as well sometimes, since Jumong is quite weak at the start, so preferably the teammate has some sort of ability that can help you out in that regard. Some good teammates for Jumong, in my opinion, would be Odur, Pestilus, Ashka, Taya and Rukan, to name a few examples. And so overall, while I think Jumong isn't as strong as he used to be, he is still definitely a very strong champion, especially in good hands, since good players will be able to leverage his range and control to really make it hard for the enemies to deal with him. He may be a bit awkward to play at first and a bit lacking in terms of survivability at the start of rounds, but practice and eventually he will be able to be a great asset to the team, I think. And so yeah, that's about it for my Jumong guide. I hope you found it useful. The next guide I have in line from the poll in my rogue guide will be a Pestilus guide, and so you can definitely look forward to that. After the Pestilus guide will be a serious guide from the votes on my Freya guide. So with those 2 guides lined up already, there will be no poll in this video. All in all, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel, like it, comment on it, share this video, and you can check out my other videos too if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.